Mike is faced with the opportunity of a lifetime, a job offer in another city, but leaving his sister Clover, for whom he has sacrificed everything since their parents' death, seems impossible. When he breaks the news, the confrontation is inevitable. Clover feels abandoned and Mikey is torn between his future and his responsibility. Now he must choose. Follow his own path or continue sacrificing his dreams. Every decision could change everything.
Mick stared at the email on his screen, his heart pounding as the words blurred before his eyes. He blinked a few times, trying to let the weight of the message sink in. This is it, he thought. The opportunity he had dreamed of for years had finally materialized, an offer from a prestigious company in another city, a chance to pursue a career that could change his life. Yet, the excitement he should have felt was eclipsed by a heavy knot tightening in his chest. His eyes flickered to the photo frame on his desk, an old picture of him and his younger sister, Clover, smiling brightly during a family trip years ago. Since their parents' death, Clover had become his responsibility. Every decision he made revolved around her. The idea of leaving her behind, of moving miles away, felt like a betrayal. Mick's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He wanted to respond immediately, to accept the offer before it slipped away, but the thought of Clover's reaction kept his hands frozen. She relied on him, emotionally, financially, and he had always been there, sacrificing his dreams for her future. But now, for the first time in years, the prospect of doing something for himself was staring him in the face. After what felt like an eternity, Mick closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. His apartment, usually a safe and comforting space, suddenly felt suffocating. He needed to tell Clover. She deserved to know, but how could he? He could already hear her voice, sharp with betrayal. "You're leaving me now? After everything?" He glanced at the clock. Clover would be home from class soon. His pulse quickened as he prepared himself for the conversation. He had rehearsed the words in his head countless times, but no matter how he framed it, it sounded like abandonment. When Clover walked through the door, tossing her backpack on the couch, Mick's stomach twisted. He stood awkwardly in the kitchen, the weight of the unspoken words pressing down on him. "Hey," she said, smiling as she pulled out a bottle of water from the fridge. "How was your day?" Her light tone only made his burden feel heavier. "Clover, we need to talk." The words tumbled out before he could stop them, more abrupt than he had intended. She paused, a slight frown crossing her face. "What's up? You okay?" He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I got a job offer in another city." Her expression shifted instantly. "Another city?" Her voice was flat, as if she hadn't processed the full meaning yet. "What do you mean?" "It's a great opportunity, Clover. It's exactly what I've been waiting for." "But," he faltered, seeing the disbelief in her eyes, "it would mean moving. I'd have to leave." For a moment, the room was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Then, Clover's face hardened, and the anger he had dreaded broke free. "So, you're just going to leave me? After everything? After all these years, Mick? You're just going to walk away?" The accusation stung more than he expected. "It's not like that. I've always been there for you, but I can't keep putting my life on hold forever." "You don't get it," she snapped, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought we were in this together, but I guess I was wrong. You're just going to abandon me." Mick's heart clenched at her words. The guilt surged through him, and for a moment, he almost considered rejecting the offer right then. But deep down, he knew that if he didn't take this chance, he might regret it for the rest of his life. Mick felt the sting of Clover's words long after the conversation had ended. The look of betrayal in her eyes haunted him as he sat on the couch, staring blankly at the darkened TV screen. The apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like a battleground, and he wasn't sure how to navigate it. Clover's bedroom door was closed, and the silence between them was deafening. The weight of her accusation, "You're going to abandon me," played over and over in his mind. He had anticipated her being upset, but nothing prepared him for the intensity of her reaction. She had been everything to him since their parents died, and now, standing at the precipice of this decision, he wondered if he had misjudged the strength of their bond or the depth of her dependence on him. He stood, unable to sit still any longer. His feet carried him toward her room, even though part of him knew it was too soon to talk again. But he had to try. He knocked gently, waiting for a response that didn't come. "Clover," he called softly. "Can we talk?" A few seconds passed before he heard the rustle of blankets and then the sound of the door unlocking. It opened just a crack, and Clover's tear-streaked face appeared, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Seeing her like that nearly undid him. "What do you want, Mick?" she asked, her voice hoarse but laced with defiance. I didn't mean for this to hurt you, he started, keeping his voice calm despite the chaos swirling inside him. You have to understand, this job, it's everything I've worked for. It's a chance for me to finally do something for myself. Do something for yourself, she interrupted, pushing the door open wider. Her anger was barely contained now, and Make could feel the frustration building between them. What about me, Make? You've always been there for me, and now, when I still need you, you're just going to leave? I'm not leaving you, he said, struggling to find the right words. I'm just trying to find a way to live my life, too. She let out a bitter laugh. That's exactly what it sounds like. You've been my rock for years, and now that I still need you, now that I'm not ready for you to leave, you're just going to go. You're stronger than you think, he said, reaching out, but she took a step back, avoiding his touch. You don't need me the way you think you do. You're independent, Clover. You've grown so much. This could be good for both of us. Good for us? Her voice broke as she looked at him, a mixture of anger and deep hurt in her eyes. I don't think you understand what this feels like, Make. It feels like you're giving up on me. You're choosing yourself over me. Make recoiled at her words, the guilt returning in full force. That's not it at all. I'm not abandoning you. I'm not giving up on you. But I have to do this for myself, Clover. I've spent years putting my life on hold. If I don't take this chance now, I don't know if I'll ever get another. Clover crossed her arms, the distance between them growing more palpable. I can't believe you're doing this. After everything we've been through, you promised you'd always be there for me. I am here for you, he pleaded, his voice thick with emotion. I've always been here for you, but maybe it's time for us to both stand on our own. Clover shook her head slowly, her face hardening again. I thought you were different. I thought family mattered more to you than anything. I guess I was wrong. With that, she turned and closed the door, leaving Mick standing in the hallway, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a heavy shroud. He had made his choice, but at what cost? Mick couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the painful conversation with Clover. The apartment was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the hum of the refrigerator in the distance. But inside his head, it was chaos. Every word she had thrown at him, abandonment, selfish, betrayal, spun around in his mind, weaving a web of guilt he couldn't shake off. Finally, after what felt like hours of tossing and turning, he threw off the covers and swung his legs over the side of the bed. He couldn't stay in that room, suffocated by the weight of his thoughts. Grabbing his jacket, he stepped out into the cool night air. The streets were deserted, a stark contrast to the turmoil he felt inside. He started walking aimlessly, letting the quiet city at night calm his restless mind. As he walked, Mick's thoughts drifted back to the past, to the time when everything changed, when he and Clover lost their parents. He had been just out of college, ready to start his own life, but that all shifted the day they died. In an instant, he became both brother and guardian. At the time, it hadn't felt like a choice. Clover was still in high school, lost and broken by the loss of their parents. He had stepped up without a second thought. It was what any responsible brother would have done. He passed a quiet park and sat down on a bench, the memories flooding back in waves. He had pushed aside his own dreams back then. An internship abroad that he had worked so hard for was gone. The chance to move to a different city for a job that would have set him on the path to his own career, gone. Each decision was made with Clover in mind. She had needed him, and he had been there. But now, the question gnawed at him, how much longer would he have to keep sacrificing? His breath clouded in the cold air as he leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. It wasn't that he resented Clover, not at all. He loved her deeply. But somewhere along the way, he had lost himself. Everything revolved around her needs, her future. He couldn't even remember the last time he made a decision purely for himself. The job offer felt like a lifeline. For the first time in years, it was something that was about him. But taking it meant breaking the delicate balance he and Clover had built together. And that terrified him. As he sat there, his mind kept circling back to the moment Clover had accused him of abandoning her. The hurt in her eyes, the tremble in her voice, it was almost unbearable. He hated that he was the cause of that pain. But what was the alternative? Keep living a life that wasn't his? Continue sacrificing his dreams indefinitely? Deep down, Meg knew Clover wasn't the helpless girl she once was. She was in college now, thriving in ways he hadn't even imagined. She had friends, she was doing well academically, she was far more independent than she gave herself credit for. But Clover clung to their arrangement, to the security that came with knowing Meg would always be there. He sighed, his breath hanging in the cold night air. Maybe the problem wasn't just Clover's fear of losing him, it was his fear of letting go. He had built his entire identity around being her protector, her guardian. If he took this job, if he moved away, who would he be then? The thought of stepping into the unknown scared him, but wasn't that exactly what life was supposed to be about? Taking risks, following your own path, even when it felt uncertain? The clock on a distant church tower chimed midnight, pulling him from his reverie. He stood up, his body cold from sitting too long in the crisp air. Meg knew one thing for sure: if he didn't take this chance now, he might never have another. But could he live with the consequences of that decision? Meg woke the next morning with the weight of the previous night's reflections still heavy on his mind. The apartment was quiet, but the tension between him and Clover lingered like a storm waiting to break. He went about his morning routine, mechanically making coffee and glancing at the closed door of Clover's room. Neither of them had spoken since the confrontation. It felt like they were drifting in different directions, even though they were still in the same space. As he sipped his coffee, his mind wandered to the sacrifices he had made over the years. The decisions that shaped his life had always been centered around Clover. It hadn't started out feeling like a burden. After all, she was his sister, and he loved her. But as the years passed, the accumulation of sacrifices began to weigh on him. He remembered the first big decision he made after their parents died. He had been accepted into a prestigious internship program overseas. It was a golden opportunity, the kind of break that could have jump-started his career in ways he had only dreamed of. But the timing was all wrong. Clover was just starting her final year of high school, and she was struggling to cope with the loss of their parents. There was no way Meg could leave her alone during such a critical time. So, he stayed. The internship slipped through his fingers, and with it, the first of many dreams. He shook his head, trying to push the regret aside, but the memories kept coming. There was the job offer a few years later, a perfect fit for his skill set, and a city that was hours away. Once again, Clover had been the reason he said no. She had just been accepted into a good college nearby, and he felt it was his duty to be there for her, to help with tuition and provide emotional support. He had reasoned with himself that it was temporary, that once she finished school, he would have his chance. But now, years later, that chance had yet to come, and the resentment he had always managed to keep buried began to rise to the surface. There were smaller sacrifices, too, ones that had chipped away at his sense of self without him even realizing it at the time. He thought about the relationships that never fully developed because he was always too busy or too committed to caring for Clover. The dates he canceled, the friendships that drifted away because he couldn't spare the time or energy. It wasn't that he blamed Clover for these things, but there was a growing sense of loss within him, a feeling that his life had been on pause for too long. Mick sighed and looked at the clock. It was mid-morning, and Clover had yet to emerge from her room. He could hear the faint sounds of her moving around, but there was no sign that she wanted to talk. Maybe it was better this way. Maybe she needed time to process everything, just as he did. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him. Each one was a reminder of the role he had played for so long, the responsible brother, the one who put everyone else's needs ahead of his own. But now, with this new opportunity hanging in front of him, he realized that he couldn't continue to live that way. He had spent so much time being what Clover needed that he had forgotten what he needed. And now that the door was opening for him, it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The truth was, Mick wasn't sure he even knew who he was outside of the role he had played for so long. But one thing was clear, he was tired of making sacrifices. This job offer, this chance to finally do something for himself, was the first real opportunity he had to reclaim his life. But would he be strong enough to take it? Mick sat at a small cafe across from his old friend Lucas, the steam from their coffee cups swirling in the air between them. Lucas had always been a source of calm for Mick, a steady presence in the storm of his life, especially after his parents had passed. When he called Lucas that morning, desperate for someone to talk to, Lucas immediately agreed to meet. Mick knew he needed a voice of reason, someone outside the situation to help him untangle the mess in his head. "So, you're really thinking about taking this job," Lucas said, stirring his coffee slowly, his eyes fixed on Mick. It wasn't a question, more of a confirmation of what he already knew. Mick nodded, but his gaze was distant, looking out the window at the people passing by on the busy street. I don't know if I can do it, Lucas. Clover needs me, and after everything we've been through, I don't know if I can live with myself if I leave her. Lucas leaned back in his chair, considering Mick's words carefully. He had known both Mick and Clover for years, had seen the way Mick took on the role of caretaker without ever questioning it. But now, he could see the strain on his friend's face, the exhaustion in his eyes. "Look, Mick," Lucas began, his voice calm but firm. "You've been carrying this weight for a long time. No one can deny that. But maybe the problem isn't that Clover needs you. Maybe it's that you've convinced yourself she does, and now you're scared of what will happen if you let go. Mick frowned, his hands tightening around the cup. What do you mean? Of course, she needs me. I've been the one holding everything together. Lucas shook his head slowly. She's not a little girl anymore, Mick. She's grown, she's in college, and she's finding her own way. You've done everything you could for her, and no one's saying you should just abandon her. But maybe it's time to let her stand on her own. You're not responsible for her entire life. The words hit Mick like a punch to the gut, even though part of him had already begun to realize this truth. For so long, his identity had been wrapped up in being Clover's protector. The idea of letting go, of stepping back, felt foreign and terrifying. You've spent years sacrificing for her, Lucas continued, leaning forward now, his gaze steady. But you can't keep living like this, Mick. You have your own life to live. If you don't take this job, if you don't take this chance for yourself, you'll wake up one day and realize that you've given everything away. And I don't think Clover would want that for you, even if she can't see it right now. Mick let the words sink in. Lucas wasn't saying anything he hadn't already considered in the back of his mind, but hearing it from someone else made it feel more real, more urgent. I'm just afraid, Lucas, Mick admitted, his voice quieter now. Afraid that if I leave, everything will fall apart. Afraid of what happens if I'm not there for her. Lucas smiled sympathetically, but there was a certain steel in his eyes. That's the thing, Mick, you're not leaving her. You'll always be her brother, always be there for her. But you don't have to sacrifice your entire future to prove it. Clover will find her way, just like you need to find yours. Mick sat back, the weight of Lucas' words settling over him. It felt like something had shifted inside him. For the first time, he saw the possibility of a different future, one where he didn't have to choose between loving his sister and following his own path. Maybe, just maybe, it was possible to do both. The apartment was still when Mick returned, but something felt different. As he stepped inside, the familiar weight of guilt that had been gnawing at him since his conversation with Clover wasn't as overwhelming. Lucas's words still echoed in his mind. Maybe it was time to let go. Maybe Clover didn't need him as much as he thought. The idea felt liberating, yet terrifying at the same time. He walked through the small living room, noting how quiet it was. Clover wasn't home yet. She must have gone out after class, which gave Mick some space to think. The tension between them had left a thick, uncomfortable air in the apartment, and he needed clarity. He moved to the kitchen to make himself a cup of tea, his mind racing with thoughts about Clover. She had always been his priority, but lately, there had been signs, subtle ones, that she was growing more independent. He thought back to the way she had handled her school projects on her own, the increasing number of nights she spent out with friends, and the times when she made decisions without consulting him first. Maybe Clover didn't need his constant presence as much as he believed. As he stirred the tea absent-mindedly, Mick found himself thinking about all the little moments that had gone unnoticed. Clover had been managing her own life in small but significant ways for a while now. Her grades were good, she had a solid group of friends, and she was doing well in college. He had been so caught up in playing the role of the protector that he hadn't really seen how far she had come. Then, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Clover. Staying out late. Don't wait up. Mick stared at the message for a moment, a strange mix of relief and sadness washing over him. It was such a simple text, but it hit him like a revelation. She didn't need him to wait up for her anymore. She was fine. She was living her life. He sat down at the kitchen table, holding the warm cup in his hands as the realization began to take root. He had spent so many years believing that he was the only thing holding their lives together, that without him, Clover would fall apart. But the truth was, Clover was already standing on her own 2 feet. Maybe she had been for a while. He remembered something Lucas had said earlier. Maybe the problem isn't that Clover needs you. Maybe it's that you've convinced yourself she does. Mick took a deep breath, feeling the truth of those words settle into him. He had built his identity around being Clover's caretaker, and now that she was becoming more self-sufficient, he didn't know what to do with himself. The thought of stepping back, of allowing her to navigate the world without him constantly hovering, felt both freeing and terrifying. But what scared him the most was the thought of what would happen if he stayed. If he continued to hold on, to deny them both the space to grow. He wasn't just holding Clover back, he was holding himself back, too. The sound of keys jingling at the door startled him from his thoughts. Clover stepped in, looking tired but calm. She gave Mick a brief glance before heading straight to her room, not saying a word. For the first time, Mick didn't feel the need to go after her, to check on her or start another difficult conversation. Instead, he let her retreat to her space, understanding that she needed it just as much as he did. Sitting there, alone in the quiet of the apartment, Mick felt a shift. The cracks in the foundation of their relationship had been exposed, and maybe that was a good thing. He had always believed that their lives were so intertwined that neither of them could function without the other. But the truth was, they had both grown in ways he hadn't realized. And now, it was time for him to accept that. The next morning, Mick woke up with a renewed sense of determination. He knew what he had to do. The fog of indecision that had clouded his mind for so long was finally lifting, and although the path ahead still seemed daunting, it was clearer than it had ever been. It was time to have the conversation with Clover that he had been avoiding, the one where he would explain his decision fully, calmly, and with certainty. Clover was already sitting at the kitchen table when Mick walked in, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone. The tension between them was still palpable, but there was a quietness in her demeanor that hadn't been there the night before. She glanced up when he entered, her expression unreadable. "Morning," Mick said cautiously as he poured himself a cup of coffee and took a seat across from her. "Morning," she replied, her voice neutral. For a few moments, the silence stretched between them, filled only by the clink of coffee mugs and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Mick could feel the weight of what needed to be said pressing down on him, but he wanted to approach it the right way this time. "I've been thinking," he began, choosing his words carefully, "about everything." Clover set her phone down, her attention fully on him now. Her eyes were wary, but there was no anger in them, just a guardedness, as if she were bracing for whatever was coming next. "I know the idea of me leaving is hard," Mick continued, "and I understand why you're upset. But I need you to know that I'm not abandoning you, Clover. I'll never abandon you. But this job, it's something I need to do for myself." Clover's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Mick thought she might lash out again. But instead, she took a deep breath and spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I get that you want this job, Mick. I really do. But it feels like you're choosing it over me. After everything we've been through, how can I not feel like that?" Mick leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I've always been there for you, Clover, and I'll continue to be. But you're not the same girl you were when we lost Mom and Dad. You've grown so much, more than I think you even realize. You're strong, you're smart, and you're capable of handling things on your own. I've seen it." She looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug, as if she was processing his words. "I don't feel that strong," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I still feel like I need you, like I can't do this without you. And that's okay," Mick said softly. "I'll always be here for you when you need me. But I think part of why you feel like that is because I've always been around. I haven't given you the space to see just how strong you are. But I know you, Clover. I know you can do this." She was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the coffee in front of her. Mick could see the internal battle she was fighting, torn between wanting to hold on to the security he had always provided and the reality that things were changing, whether she liked it or not. Finally, she looked up at him, her expression softer than it had been in days. "I don't want you to go," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't want to hold you back either." Mick felt a knot in his chest loosen. "I'm not going far, Clover. We'll still talk, and I'll come visit. This isn't the end of us." She nodded slowly, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "I know. It just feels like everything is changing." "It is," Mick agreed, reaching across the table to take her hand. "But change doesn't have to be a bad thing." For the first time in what felt like weeks, Clover gave him a small, tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Mick sat at his desk, staring at the email on his laptop screen. The cursor blinked expectantly in the reply field, waiting for him to make the final decision. The job offer, the one that had set this entire emotional journey into motion, was right in front of him, ready to be accepted or declined with a single click. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Time was running out. The company had given him a deadline, and it was fast approaching. Part of him wanted to close the laptop and walk away, let the opportunity pass by, as he had done so many times before. But this time was different. This time, he couldn't ignore the pull inside him, the deep yearning for something more than the life he had been living. His conversation with Clover earlier that morning had changed something. She had finally understood, even if it was only a small part of her that accepted it, that his decision to leave wasn't about abandoning her. And in that brief moment of understanding between them, Mick felt the weight of his guilt begin to lift. But even with Clover's tentative approval, doubt still gnawed at him. He had lived in the role of caretaker for so long that the idea of stepping outside it, of putting himself first, felt foreign. It felt selfish. He had always defined himself by the sacrifices he made for others, first for his parents, then for Clover. Who would he be if he wasn't the one taking care of everything? As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Mick stood up and walked to the window. The city sprawled out before him, busy and vibrant, full of opportunities. The company offering him the job was in another city, a new place where he could build something for himself. It wasn't just about the job, it was about creating a life that was his own, something he hadn't done in years. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass, closing his eyes as memories of the past flooded him. Every sacrifice he had made, every moment he had put someone else's needs above his own, played out like a film reel in his mind. The countless times he had walked away from opportunities, convincing himself that there would always be another chance, another time for him to focus on himself. But those chances had never come. He had always chosen to stay. The truth was clear now. If he didn't take this job, if he didn't seize this opportunity, he would never stop living in the shadow of what could have been. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking through his thoughts. He picked it up and saw a text from Clover. "I know you're still thinking about it, but I want you to know, it's okay if you take the job. I'll be okay. I promise." Mick stared at the message, a wave of emotions rushing through him. Clover had always been stronger than she gave herself credit for, but seeing her willingness to let him go, however difficult it was for her, meant more than she could ever know. He sat back down at his desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. For a moment, he hesitated, but then the decision became clear. He wasn't just choosing a job, he was choosing a future where both he and Clover could thrive independently. He was choosing to finally live for himself, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. With a deep breath, Mick began typing his response. The words came easily now. "I'd like to formally accept the offer." He hit send, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. There was no turning back now. He had chosen himself, and for the first time in years, that didn't feel like a betrayal. As he closed the laptop, Mick exhaled, a sense of calm washing over him. It wasn't going to be easy, change never was, but he had made his choice. And for once, it was the right one. The day of Mick's departure arrived more quickly than he had anticipated. The weeks leading up to it had been a whirlwind of preparations, packing boxes, finalizing details with the new company, and saying goodbye to the familiar routines he had built over the years. But the hardest part was knowing that he was leaving Clover behind, even if it was for the best. Now, as he stood in the middle of their small apartment, surrounded by neatly packed boxes and suitcases, the reality of his decision hit him with full force. This was it. Everything he had known for so long was about to change. There was a knot of anxiety in his stomach, but it was mixed with something else, excitement. The life he had put on hold was finally about to begin. Clover emerged from her room, her face calm, though Mick could tell there was an undercurrent of emotion just below the surface. She had been quieter than usual in the days leading up to this moment, but Mick understood. They had shared so much for so long that the idea of parting, even temporarily, was difficult for both of them. "You ready?" Clover asked softly, standing by the door. Mick nodded, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag on his shoulder. "Yeah, I think so." He glanced around the apartment one last time, memories flooding back of the life they had shared here, the laughter, the tears, the countless moments of support and love. It had been their safe haven, but now it was time to leave it behind. Clover crossed the room and stood in front of him, her eyes searching his face. "I know I haven't said much lately, but I'm proud of you, Mick. I know this isn't easy, but I'm really proud of you for taking this step." Her words caught him off guard, and he felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected her to say that, not after everything they had been through. "Thanks, Clover. That means a lot." She gave him a small, sad smile and then, without warning, wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug. Mick hesitated for a moment before returning the embrace, holding her close as the weight of the moment settled over them. This was goodbye, not forever, but it felt significant, like the end of a chapter they had been writing together for years. "You're going to be okay," Mick whispered into her hair, more as a reassurance to himself than to her. "We're both going to be okay." "I know," she murmured, her voice muffled against his chest. "It's just, I'm going to miss you." "I'm going to miss you too," he said, pulling back to look at her. "But we'll still see each other. I'll visit, and you can come to the city whenever you want. This isn't goodbye forever." Clover nodded, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "I know. It's just, it feels big, you know?" "Yeah," Mick agreed, feeling the same weight pressing down on him. "It does." They stood there for a moment longer, neither of them wanting to break the fragile connection that had formed between them. But eventually, Mick stepped back, taking a deep breath. "I have to go," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Clover nodded, her eyes watery but full of understanding. "Yeah, you do." He picked up his suitcase and headed for the door, but before he opened it, he turned back to her one last time. "Take care of yourself, Clover." "You too," she replied, her voice steady now. "Go be amazing." Mick smiled, feeling a surge of affection for his sister. "I'll try." With one last glance at the apartment, Mick stepped out into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him. As he walked down the stairs, a strange mixture of sadness and anticipation filled him. He was leaving, but he wasn't losing anything. If anything, he was gaining a chance to truly find himself. The train rumbled steadily beneath Mick's feet as it sped toward the new city, the landscape outside the window blurring into a mix of colors. He watched absent-mindedly, his thoughts drifting between the past and the future. The city ahead was unfamiliar, a place full of possibilities, but for the first time in a long while, Mick felt a sense of freedom that was both exhilarating and terrifying. His phone buzzed in his lap, pulling him from his reverie. It was a message from Clover. "Got back to the apartment. Feels weird without you here, but I'll be okay. Promise. Miss you already." Mick smiled softly at the screen, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. Clover was stronger than either of them had given her credit for. She had come a long way, and so had he. Their bond was still there, even with the distance that now separated them. "Miss you too. I'll call once I'm settled. We'll figure out a visit soon." He hit send and slipped the phone back into his pocket, leaning his head against the seat and closing his eyes for a moment. The weeks leading up to this had been emotionally draining, but there was a quiet sense of relief settling in now. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. The train's steady rhythm seemed to match the pace of his thoughts as they drifted to what lay ahead. His new job, a new apartment, a new routine. The city would be a fresh start, a blank canvas for him to create a life that was truly his own. The thought both excited and unnerved him. He had spent so long living for someone else, making decisions based on what was best for Clover, that he wasn't entirely sure what it felt like to live for himself. But now he would find out. As the city skyline came into view, Mick felt a jolt of anticipation. His thoughts flickered back to the email he had received from his new boss the night before. The company was eager to have him, and the team seemed enthusiastic about his arrival. It felt like everything was falling into place, yet there was still so much unknown ahead. The train slowed as it pulled into the station, the brakes screeching softly as they came to a halt. Mick stood up, grabbing his duffel bag and slinging it over his shoulder. He followed the stream of passengers out onto the platform, the bustling energy of the city greeting him with the sound of honking horns and the chatter of people going about their day. Standing there, surrounded by the rush of the city, Mick felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. This was the beginning of something new. He wasn't entirely sure what that something would be yet, but for the first time, he was open to it. He wasn't tied down by the past or weighed down by guilt. He had made his choice, and now it was time to embrace it. As he walked toward the exit, Mick felt his phone buzz again. It was another text from Clover, this time a picture of her sitting in their old apartment, her feet up on the coffee table, a pizza box open in front of her. "Just me and pizza tonight. Weird, huh?" Mick laughed to himself, feeling a surge of affection for his sister. She was adjusting in her own way, just as he was. They were both navigating this new chapter, and though it was strange and unfamiliar, it didn't feel wrong. "Don't eat all the pizza without me. I'll be back to visit soon." As he stepped out of the station and into the bustling streets of his new city, Mick felt the excitement bubble up again. He had no idea what the future held, but he was ready to find out. And for the first time in a long time, he felt free.